Imagine if your entire world, your culture, your identity, your whole future was built on the land right beneath your feet. Now, imagine someone just takes it all away. That's pretty much the story of the Kikuyu people under British colonial rule. We're going to dive into how their society was systematically taken apart, piece by painful piece.
This one sentence, honestly, this is the key to understanding everything that follows. For the Kikuyu, land wasn't just dirt you could buy or sell. No, it was the very fabric of their existence. It was the heart of their social, their economic, and their spiritual lives.
So, to really get a sense of the scale of the loss, we first have to see what was lost. Let's take a step into the world of the Kikuyu before the British showed up, a world where culture and land were basically the same thing.
Okay, so this right here, this just shatters a core colonial myth. You see, the British often argued that Africans had no real concept of private property, which, made it easier to justify taking their land. But the Kikuyu had this incredibly developed system called githaka. These were family-owned estates passed down through generations. This was ownership, plain and simple.
And this connection to the land, it shaped every single stage of life. For a man, having land was his path to becoming an adult. He needed it to provide a bride wealth so he could get married and gain status in the community. And for a woman, well, land was her ability to provide for her family. Without access to it, you just weren't seen as a complete person in their society.
So into this stable, deeply rooted world comes this entirely new force, the British settlers. And they weren't just looking for a bit of farmland. They were a political machine, and they had a very clear agenda, and more importantly, the power to make it happen.
And their influence was just staggering. They managed to get themselves seats on the Kenya Legislative Council. They got low-interest government loans and subsidies for their crops. And then, this was the big one, they had their land leases extended from 99 years to 999 years. They weren't just borrowing the land, they were taking it essentially forever.
So what on earth fueled this sense of entitlement? Well, it was a deep-seated, so-called scientific racism. They justified taking the land with this toxic idea that Africans were biologically inferior and needed to be controlled for their own good. This wasn't just some casual prejudice. It was the foundation of colonial policy. The result of all this power and ideology was, maybe inevitably, the physical seizure of the best Kikuyu land. This whole area, the heart of their ancestral home, would soon get a new name: the White Highlands.
60,000 acres. Just let that number sink in for a second. And this wasn't just any old land. This was the vibrant, fertile heartland of the Kikuyu people. Their home for generations, just ripped away to create European farms. The scale of it is almost impossible to imagine.
And the consequences were absolutely devastating. For centuries, when the Kikuyu population grew, they would just expand into new areas. But suddenly, they were trapped, completely hemmed in, surrounded by settler farms, government forest reserves, and the new city of Nairobi. Their traditional way of life was literally fenced off.
And don't think for a second this was some chaotic, lawless land grab. It was actually far more sinister. It was a methodical, legalized dispossession. You can see it here, a series of ordinances and commissions, year after year, just chipping away at Kikuyu land rights, until by 1934, their claims were officially gone, and European ownership was locked in by law.
But this colonial project wasn't just about land. It was also a direct attack on Kikuyu culture itself, all under the banner of a so-called civilizing mission. And this brought a whole new kind of conflict to the table.
The soldiers on the front lines of this cultural war, they were Christian missionaries. And their goal wasn't just to win converts. It was total replacement, an attempt to erase Kikuyu traditions and social structures, and install a Western Christian model instead.
And the flashpoint for this cultural war became the practice of female circumcision. Now, to the missionaries, this was barbaric. But to the Kikuyu, it was at the absolute core of their social fabric. It was the rite of passage that turned a girl into a woman, which then allowed for marriage and the exchange of bride wealth that bound families together. So, to attack this practice, that was like attacking their society's ability to even continue.
So, the missionaries banned the practice, and the colonial government backed them up, which, as you can imagine, created a total firestorm. But the Kikuyu response was incredible. Instead of just giving in, thousands of them walked away from the mission churches and did something really radical. They built their own independent schools and churches, a powerful statement of cultural independence.
This cultural battle fed directly into the rise of organized political resistance. The Kikuyu people didn't just suffer in silence, they started to organize and fight back, using new political tools.
And the main vehicle for this new resistance was the Kikuyu Central Association, or the KCA. It was formed in the early 1920s by some of the educated young men, and it quickly became the first real political organization dedicated to challenging colonial rule.
Led by future leaders like Jomo Kenyatta, the KCA decided to play the British at their own game. They used petitions, they used constitutional channels, and they took their fight for land rights all the way to the halls of power in London. And because they were also defending cultural practices, they gained massive, widespread support from the Kikuyu people.
And how did the British administration respond to these reasoned constitutional arguments? With complete and utter contempt. They just refused to see the KCA as legitimate leaders. Instead, they were labeled dangerous and subversive agitators, and their demands were met with, and this is a direct quote, unequivocal hostility.
So let's pull all these threads together. You have the loss of land, the attack on culture, the dismissal of any political protest, all of this combined over decades to have a truly devastating, cumulative impact on Kikuyu society.
You know, Jomo Kenyatta himself really said it best. Taking the land wasn't just stealing property, it was taking away the material symbol that holds family and tribe together. It was a single act of theft that basically shattered the foundations of their entire world.
By the 1940s, the picture was just grim. Landlessness was everywhere, which led to rising poverty. The social structures that depended on land were collapsing. The reserves were dangerously overcrowded. There was a loss of cultural confidence, and underneath it all, a deep, simmering anger over stolen land and a government that just refused to listen.
So, we're left with this huge, lingering question. The Colonial Project was ruthlessly effective at dismantling the pillars of Kikuyu society. But when you tear down the very foundations of a people's world, what gets built in its place? What does that legacy of loss and resistance actually look like today?